Connor Mead, and I'm here today at the 2017 Canadian Science Policy Conference. And joining me right now is Bev Holmes, CEO of the Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research, Eric Meslin, the President and CEO of the Council of Canadian Academies, and Krista, Connell, the CEO of the Nova Scotia Health Research Foundation. So thank you all so much for joining me, and I'm really excited for this conversation.
Happy to be here with you.
Yeah. So to get us started off, I wonder if you could share your thoughts on the role of the provinces in developing health funding policy, and what role your organizations play in that.
Well, I may go first, Connor. As you may know, the Council of Canadian Academies undertook an assessment on the subject of those areas of science policy below the federal level. We called it subnational, but federal and its relationship with the provinces and territories. It's an exciting area of science policy because I think you know that science occurs not just at the federal government level, funded by the federal government or undertaken by federally funded scientists, but the provinces themselves not only play a significant role, but they're the home of where health and education and universities are, where a lot of the activity goes. And our assessment was interesting, to say the least. It showed a number of the challenges, the barriers. Some of them are straightforward, like good coordination and good communication. Some of them were a little more delicate, funding and governance and regulation. But at the end of the day, we certainly saw a lot of opportunity for better collaboration and coordination between federal, provincial, and territorial governments.
Fantastic. So what do you think are some of the positive outcomes that are associated with more effective collaboration in that space?
Well, I'll go first, and I want to point out that I'm speaking from a health research funding perspective. Science policy is obviously broader than that, but health can, health really can be a test case for that, if you will. So Krista and I, in our provincial organizations, are really excited about what's happening at the federal level in terms of the rejuvenation of the scientific enterprise. From a provincial perspective, we're getting it together within our provinces. We actually have it pretty good across provinces. What we're really looking forward to is connecting the provincial and the federal levels. And in a blog post that we wrote for the Canadian Science Policy Conference, we're arguing that the provinces need to be at the table for three reasons. First of all, our funding programs really set our players up in the provinces for success at the federal level. So we, rather than reacting to what's coming out at that level, we want to be at the table to plan and execute so that the programs that we launch are actually synergistic with the federal level. So there's the funding programs that we operate. Secondly, we have a lot of expertise. So you may have heard the phrase fund and forget, which is what funding agencies used to be accused of. I'm not sure whether it was ever right, but right now we don't fund and forget. We care a lot about the systems into which we're launching our programs. One area of expertise that I'll just give an example is impact measurement. So we have a lot of expertise on how we can look at the impact of health research. And we can do that broadly across the province, or across the country rather. And I guess the third area that's really, really important is that we know our provinces. And when it comes to some of the difficult discussions that need to be had, we can be seen as neutral conveners of the various players in our own provinces, bring them to the table to have not only provincial discussions, but discussions that can go across the country.
So I'm going to jump in and change the conversation a little bit, the direction of it. We don't have coordinated science policy across the country. We should, but we don't. And it's not getting enough conversation, enough attention. So, I was on a panel a little earlier this afternoon, and part of what I was supposed to do in the panel is point out that it isn't happening. Those conversations aren't happening. So we had these wonderful speeches last night at the gala. Nobody talked about the provinces, not our wonderful Governor General, not the Canadian Science Policy folks, nobody. Today we heard from our chief scientist. Wonderful, again, speech. I loved everything I heard. Not a mention of the provinces. The Naylor panel, very little, very short shrift, which is not a great term, but of acknowledgement of the provincial role in the research enterprise. And it's a wonderful report, and I fully support it. But when you start to put all of this together, you see what I call a big black hole. There's a real issue. We're never going to advance Canada and the international scene if we don't start recognizing the huge role that provinces have. And Bev did a great job, thank you, of summarizing it. But we're talking about, where do the scientific careers happen? They start in the provinces. Who's supporting the students? It's the provinces. Who's funding the universities? It's the provinces. And then you get into policy areas, jurisdictional policy areas, where Dr. Niemer talked about informed decision making. Well, where does that happen for health? Where does that happen for education and other areas that are provincial jurisdictions? So it's a problem, and we really need to elevate the conversation. And I was even looking at the little sign behind us with I think they're called Wordles. There's no mention of the provinces. So I don't think it's an intentional oversight, but I think it's a critical one to point out, and we need to change the dialogue.
So what's kind of interesting about what we've heard is it can be looked at not so much glass half full and glass half empty, but hearing Trista's pretty powerful statement, fact-based, evidence-based statement, this is the case. So what do we want to do about it? Step one is certainly figuring out what the problem is and at what level. You know what, I think we all know what the problem is. It's going to take some political will. It's going to take some discomfort at the level of sharing of information, sharing of governance, dealing with multiple interests. We don't have to go back in Canada's history to realize that the country was built through an agreement, a consensus of federal and provincial relations. So it's not that we've never done this before, but if it were really easy, it would have been solved. So I think we need to acknowledge that it's not just a matter of sending some more funding. It would be nice if there was more funding for a start. But it's not as simply a money problem. It's not simply a labor problem. It's not simply, and you could go along a list. Again, the work that the panel at CCA convened, which was a workshop that brought together a number of experts from across the country and elsewhere, and it didn't make recommendations as much as drew conclusions around these areas, conclusions that said now is the time. It's really an ideal time. This would be my view, not reflected so much in the report, but in some ways there is an opportunity for some experimentation within the provinces and the federal government. This doesn't have to be everyone must be at the table all at one time agreeing. Nova Scotia is undertaking some work on its own. BC is exercising leadership. This isn't a, dare I say, like the Health Accord, where there's a decision about how do we get everyone together in the same room for something that may cause division and upset. It seems to me that science and health policy jointly are at an ideal time in Canada's history where everyone's interested. The very people that Trista mentioned, a chief science advisor, a minister of science, an engaged minister of industry, science, and economic development. In fact, you could go across the entire cabinet. Everyone has an interest in getting science into their policy, and it turns out that that's not limited to the federal government. You could have the same conversation in the provincial legislatures as well.
And I do think that you're right, Eric, it's not all about money. Without doubt, there is more money that's needed, and there's been numerous analyses that have showed that. But often when you just put more money into a system that's actually not working, you get some great things happening, but you get even more duplication, you get even more inefficiencies. And it feels like right now is a really perfect time to embrace movement on this. And you're right, we know what needs to happen. We need to start working on this together and stop seeing collaboration as just a motherhood term, but actually take some practical steps towards collaboration. And it feels too that people are ready to kind of back away from talking about who needs more money than who else, who needs more attention, and actually be doing more of this together. And quite frankly, it's not only about, just to your point about the money, there are some pretty serious conflicting incentives in the system. And we have to grapple with those and say that whatever programs we're launching as individuals, those are only going to be as effective as the system into which they are launched. So if we're launching something that's a great program, but it is blocked at every turn by the policies or lack of policies and so on, they're never going to be very good. So time to get on with it.
There's a real window of opportunity in the country right now, clearly. I mean, the conversations we're having right here, the conversations we've had during the conference, the session we had this afternoon someone was telling me the biggest lineup of people to ask questions, and they were great questions. So, and I think they ended up with, so now what do we do? So people are ready to start taking action. We don't have to convince anyone anymore about the right thing to do. That's incredible. So it's a great place to be, but now we really need to figure out the hard part. What do we do?
You know, one thing that we heard again at our panel discussion this afternoon here at the CSPC was a real enthusiasm from the younger generation. I feel it's odd to say that, but the folks who are really just coming out of their as early as their undergraduate years, but the graduate students and postdocs who are unimpressed with the names of the problems that we're describing. Well, it's very difficult. We don't have sort of regulatory fluidity to share data across provincial and federal. Well, why not? They're asking those good and hard questions for which I think we have a responsibility, we as a community have a responsibility to answer. So when we talk about what are the next steps and where do you go, one of the things that came up at our session was someone said, well, just start. And well, is starting writing a letter to your MP and your MPP at the same time? Is it petitioning? Is it appearing before a committee? It's probably going to be all of the above. And it may have to be a topic that drives it as an example. Maybe it's data sharing. Which is a great and non-controversial topic. It's not like
it's not controversial.
Well, I hear. Good point.
Who have you been talking to?
It probably is. Well, let me qualify. It's controversial in a way that doesn't invoke public fear and trembling in the way that GMO technology might. But data, apart from the privacy and ethical issues, which I'm very much aware of, I'm referring to the ability of provinces to share with one another the information that they have to help advance good health and science policy. That takes political will and it takes a bit of legislative maneuvering, but it's not an impossible task for us to get on with. So that may not be the best topic, but I think you've got to pick a topic. You can't just say, let's have better federal provincial science policy collaboration. Maybe it's going to be regionally based. We heard again today that the territories are starting to work together collaboratively. Maybe they're doing that because of their geographic isolation. Maybe they're just not waiting for everyone else to get on with it. They're going to take the lead. So I'd like to see that kind of innovation in this science policy environment. That may be what we need, innovation in how we do science policy.
And as far as convincing some of the powers that be, because we can't pretend that it won't happen with some of that convincing, one of the questions or the comments that came up at the panel this afternoon that I thought was fascinating was, in X province, we don't have a science policy because they think everything's working fine without it. That was really instructive to me. We love to be positive in Canada and approach it from, look what we could actually have happen if we had science policy at all the provinces that worked in sync with federal policy. Maybe we also have to start to pull out some of the negative, which is actually there are many areas in which it is not working, and here are the data that show you that it's not working, and therefore we have to do this.
True. Fine doesn't make you an international leader.
That's right. Yeah.
Well said.
So what do you think are some of the major obstacles to this kind of greater coordination? I think it sounds like there's a good amount of alignment in terms of recognizing that a lot of these initiatives are good sense. So what are the actual barriers to implementation and what can we do to fix them?
Well, first, I'll jump in because that list I gave you earlier, there's an appalling lack of awareness of the role that the provinces play and should be playing in this scientific research enterprise. So we have to, that's one thing. And I think we're doing well on that front. We're raising awareness, we're having sessions here and so on. But I wouldn't say it's uniformly understood within government, within the academic sectors. For example, we still have federal research agencies going directly to the universities and completely bypassing the provincial system. And that causes all sorts of issues, as you can imagine, without coordination and communication. So we have a little ways to go on that front for starters.
Well, CCA is happy to send out copies of the assessment that we did on this topic. It's been quite gratifying that anytime someone gets their hands on it, they say, well, that's an interesting document. I hadn't thought about that. A framework built into it that the expert panel put together. It's not the answer to this problem, but it's a set of information that I think people can use. What's going to happen after that, Connor, I think is all, as I said before, all of the above. Someone's going to have to take the initiative to either experiment with a particular example. I used data before, but it could be the development of postdoctoral training. There are any number of areas in which there is common ground that people realize that we don't have a harmonized opportunity. The other more provocative proposal is that perhaps there should be some incentives built in to the way that the federal-provincial relationship occurs in other ways. There's plenty of discussions about trade, there are plenty of discussions about health. Lots of things happen between the federal government and the provinces. Maybe science should be put squarely on the agenda. Maybe it should be a First Minister's meeting priority. What are these topics? How could we address them? What kind of progress can we make over the next 2 or 3 years? We have already referred to the Minister of Science and the Chief Science Advisor. I suspect that they would enjoy hearing and learning about this topic. I can tell you just from CCA's perspective that when this assessment occurred, and it was not funded by the federal government, it was funded by the government of Alberta, which we're absolutely allowed to accept requests from non-federal sponsors. It was received as with gratitude by the federal government. They don't have responsibility for provincial science or health or education, but they were pleased that this had occurred. So I think that kind of goodwill reservoir needs to be topped up a bit. It's not all bad, it's not all horrible. This is one of those areas where we should all be thinking about what the sort of renegotiation of the social contract is. What do we want the country to look like? And if science and evidence is part of it, including health policy, then get some low-hanging fruit. Find a topic, figure out what those barriers are. If they're regulatory or legislative, have a conversation about them. If they're public attitudes, let's do some education. I suspect that the public probably doesn't care about the lines between the borders that separate Manitoba from Ontario when they've been told that we live in a country that is from coast to coast to coast. So I'm not exactly sure where the first step is, but doing nothing isn't an option.
Mm-hmm. And I think just 2 thoughts on the barriers question is, first of all, if there's been a competition, there continues to be a competition. It always happens when there's little funding, and people don't like to make decisions in times of competition. If they think that there's something to lose, then it's easier not to act. Right now, it actually feels like people are at the same table saying, okay, it seems like there's more actually to be gained than lost if we start to work more closely together. But secondly, and to Krista's point, the lack of awareness and understanding in a complex and busy problem, if you don't have to pay attention to something, you don't pay attention to it. So to your point, we actually have to put it on the table and make it be a topic worthy of attention. And I think we're there.
Maybe we need a science accord.
You say that in passing.
I don't really mean it. I mean, I don't really mean it in passing. I actually think a conversation at that level would be really, really great. Although whether we'd want everyone to sign on and go down that path, I don't think is necessary, but that level, First Minister's Conference on Science would be amazing. There.
So I guess we've got our Globe and Mail headline for tomorrow morning. First Minister's Accord.
You're on notice.
Yeah. So is there anything else you'd like to add just on this topic? It's been a fantastic discussion. I want to make sure that you get every idea out into this tape that you have. So are there any other areas of this issue that you'd like to explore?
Well, I just want to say this is a positive conversation.
Yeah, agreed.
Just the fact that we're having it, that is a forum for us to have it, is amazing. This would not have happened 10 years ago. So, that's huge, and I think we should, acknowledge that.
And every challenge flipped over is an opportunity. And that's where we're at.
Well said.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time. And,
Thank you.
Enjoy the dinner and the reception.
Thanks.
Thanks.